we'd have a good message already. But judge righteous judgment. That is, that's really saying, let's look at it the way God looks at it, and don't judge by appearance. Now, I want to go back into the book of Mark and look at the 4th chapter and read. Here the choir was singing, when the storm clouds rise o'er this heavenly trail, I'll just keep trusting the Lord. Well, I want to read here a little bit about the storm that the disciples were in. In the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, starting with the 35th verse. And the same day when even was come, he saith unto them, let us pass over into the other side. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. And there was also with him other little ships, and there arose a great storm of wind. I think the International Version says a furious gale or something like that. And the waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. And he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? And he arose and rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. And he said unto them, Why are ye so fearful? How is it that ye have no faith? I think the New International Version says, how is it that you, is it still lack faith? Something like that. Do you still have no faith? That is, after all they had seen Jesus do, he said, do you still have no faith? And they feared exceedingly and said one to another, What manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his precious word. Now, I want us to look at this just a little bit. I think the greatest hindrance to your faith and to mine is the spirit of analyzation. And I don't know that any of us, I'm sure that none of us escape the temptation of it. We may escape doing it, but we certainly do not escape the temptation of it. For it began even in the garden, and this is where Adam and Eve lost out with God. God said, you don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and God said you'll die, the devil said you won't die. And said when she saw the tree, that is, she began to look it over, to analyze the situation and see if what God said was true. And lo and behold, when she looked at the tree and saw it was good for food, and a tree pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she came to the conclusion, now notice, after looking it over, analyzing it, she came to the conclusion that God was wrong and the devil was right. Now that's what analyzation did. She came to the conclusion that God was wrong. It says, when she looked at the tree and saw that it was good for food, a tree to be desired to make one wise, and pleasant to the eyes, she came to the conclusion that God was wrong. She was judging by appearance. Jesus said, don't judge that way. Take what God says, regardless of what it appears to be. So I want us to look at this little story here a little bit in Mark, because this 4th chapter. And this storm that they were in, Jesus said, how is it? Do you still have no faith? The Sea of Galilee, they tell me, was about 682 feet below sea level, right in that area. And they say that storms can arise very quickly because of being so low. The heat that arises from it can somehow cause the winds to come in such a way that storms can sweep down on that sea furiously and very suddenly in this particular case. And so here's Jesus now. I want you to notice he said to them, let's go to the other side. And he got into the boat and went to sleep. Why shouldn't he? He only did what God told him to do. And God told him to go to the other side. So he went to sleep. Now, he told the disciples, he said, let's go to the other side. And when this storm arose, they looked at the situation, and it's rather interesting. They looked around, where's he's asleep in this storm. And they were about to perish, and they went and awoke him, and they said to him, Jesus, don't you care whether or not we drown? Don't you care? Now, I don't know if you've ever been in a storm of any kind and just kind of wondered whether or not Jesus cared. Jesus, don't you care? I remember years ago as a young man, I was in a situation in a church where I was just my early ministry, and I first met Brother Helm, and I remember there was a situation arising in the church, and I remember praying that way, Lord, don't you care? And I mentioned it to Brother Helm, and when I did, I saw him go, to think that as a young man, I'd say to Jesus, don't you care? Have you ever been in a situation that you thought Jesus was asleep and not paying any attention to what the situation you're in, they didn't care? Come on now, you be honest with me. Lord, don't you care? This problem I'm in, this situation I'm in, this trial I'm going through, is he asleep? Doesn't he see the situation? And if he sees it, doesn't he care? Well, that's what they were saying. Jesus, don't you care? We're about to drown, and don't you care? Now, as I said, how many times does it look like in our lives that Jesus simply doesn't care and that he's asleep? Now, when they analyzed the situation, what happened? They began to rebuke Jesus. You got us into this storm. You told us to go to the other side, and we're doing what you told us to do, and now we're about to perish in it. Don't you care? Well, how many fall over the spirit of analyzation? They judge by appearance. When Jesus said, let us go to the other side, faith would have said, now fellas, Jesus said we're going to the other side, and I don't care what the storm looks like, but we're going to get there. That's what faith would have said. But their faith was gone because they looked at appearance, and Jesus said to them, how is it that you have no faith? So analyzation caused them to really blame Jesus. They were trying to obey him. He said, get in this boat, we're going to the other side, and they got into the storm, and then it looked like he didn't care. You've been trying to serve Jesus for how many years or weeks or months or years? You've been trying to serve him. Now you're in a storm, and it looks like he doesn't care now. You've been trying to obey him. And furthermore, Jesus was asleep, because God had said to go to the other side. They woke him up. He didn't. They woke him up and said, don't you care? I want you to see something that's rather interesting. When they woke him up, he didn't sympathize with them a bit and say, oh, I'm so sorry, fellas. I went to sleep and I didn't pay any attention and I made this mistake. Please forgive me. He didn't sympathize with them one bit for the storm they were in. And because they thought he had forgotten them, he didn't sympathize one iota with them. Isn't that something? That when you think, Jesus, what's the matter with the storm? I want you to know that he won't sympathize with you one bit. Isn't that wonderful? They were probably looking for him to say, oh, I'm so sorry, fellas, this slipped up on me, and we'll try to do something about it. He arose and rebuked the storm. No, he arose and said to the storm, peace, be still, and he turned to them and said, why are you afraid? Why is it that you have no faith? In other words, he was saying to them, why have you awakened me? You should have taken care of the storm anyway without even bothering me. Isn't that what he said? Jesus said, so they awoke him, and he didn't sympathize with them one iota. He didn't give them any sympathy whatsoever. And someone said Jesus never apologized to anybody because he was never wrong. Whatever Jesus has asked you to do, I don't care what the storm and the situation, he's never been wrong. So he didn't get up and apologize to these men because he was wrong. So Jesus arose, rebuked the wind, and there was a great calm. And then he just simply said to them, why is it that you have no faith? After all you've seen me doing, he was saying to them that you should have stilled the storm. Instead of saying, Jesus, awake and still the storm, they should have stilled it. And how many storms we get into and wait for Jesus to still the storm, when by faith, if we really had the faith in Jesus, we ourselves might speak to the storm and be quiet. Jesus said, speak to this mountain and doubt not. Once God says something, we need to hold on until it comes to pass. Now, the storm may not abate as quickly as this did when he spoke, but at least they were safe. As long as they were obeying Jesus, they were safe anyhow. It makes me think that God's children are often likened unto two things, to sheep and to eagles. And you know, sheep, I've mentioned before, and speaking on sheep will always go into a storm. They face a storm. And God's children do that, but there are some that are eagles, and eagles don't face the storm. They spread those great wings and rise above it. So some of God's children stay below and endure it, and some rise above it. The same storm. Oh, that God can help us to have wings to rise above it. And if these disciples, if they couldn't rise above it, at least they could have endured it, but they got afraid and cried to Jesus and said, don't you care? This nature is in us all. If we're not careful, see, we'll analyze a situation and look at it. And I think Brother Helm said it's one of the reasons why people backslide, is analyzing what God says and does. We begin to analyze it. It doesn't look right. Look at Mary and Martha. When Lazarus was sick, they sent word to him and said, Lord, he whom thou lovest is sick. And Jesus tarried there, said 4 more days until Lazarus died. And then he came. And when Martha came, she said, oh, Lord, if you'd have been here. I want you to notice really what's happening. Lord, if you'd have listened to me. If you'd have come when I asked you to. My brother wouldn't have died. Just a gentle rebuke, but she was telling him, Lord, if you'd have been here, now we sent you word. He wouldn't have died. And he wouldn't have died, and so Jesus said, well, I'm the resurrection, but they couldn't get a hold of it. It's interesting to me, it says that Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible. 2 words, Jesus wept. Why did he weep? He wasn't weeping over Lazarus. He said he saw them weeping. Mary and Martha and the friends, he saw them all weeping, and he was disturbed and troubled in his soul. And it says, and Jesus wept. He wasn't weeping over Lazarus. I want you to know something. He wasn't weeping over what they were weeping over. I really believe he was weeping because they were weeping. If they hadn't been weeping, he'd have never been weeping. And he wept because they shouldn't have been weeping. Because he knew that Lazarus was going to be raised. He knew that. He said, I'm the resurrection, and Lazarus will rise. He knew that, and still he wept. He wept because they were weeping. But they analyzed the situation, you see, and as a result, they couldn't grasp it. Look at the woman with the issue of blood. Isn't it amazing how many times the disciples rebuked Jesus? Imagine, they rebuked him. Look at the woman with the issue of blood. And he was on his way to heal or someone, and to hear this lady, the woman with the issue of blood, touches him, slips through the crowd and thought, if I can just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be whole. And she slipped through that crowd, touched the hem of his garment, and slipped off. And Jesus turned around and said, "Who touched me?" What did the disciples do? They rebuked Jesus. They said, "Lord, look at this throng around you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" They rebuked him. What did they do? They analyzed the situation immediately. And they turned around and rebuked Jesus. Well, Brother Faith would have said, "Boys, Jesus said, 'Who touched him?' Back off here now. Let's find out. We got to find out who touched him." That's what Faith would have said, but they turned and rebuked him and said, "Lord, the throng you know on every side, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" The spirit of analyzation, you see, keeps us from believing exactly what God wants us to do. How many times did the disciples say to Jesus he was wrong? Look at Peter rebuking Jesus for going to the cross. He rebuked. I'm amazed. And yet we do it the very same way. We follow through the very same things in our own lives. Look at the woman who anointed the feet of Jesus. And they said, "Well, why this waste, spending this money?" They analyzed the situation and didn't like what he was doing. So the spirit of analyzation puts us down the wrong road. The spirit of analyzation is always trying to straighten Jesus out. Think of that. We don't like the way he's handling our situation, our lives, and the situation where we don't like it. And so we rebuke him for it and complain to him about it. And say, "Lord, if you'd have done it this way, and you're too late, and why haven't you done it?" Well, you've been asleep. How hard it is to get things done in the church because of the spirit of analyzation. How hard is it for the pastor to follow God and do what God says without people analyzing what he's doing? Sorry if I pause there a minute. Did you hear me? I don't like what he's doing. Why? They're analyzing it and judging by appearance, and it doesn't add up. So many things can't be done because of the spirit of analyzation. Once we have Jesus' word for something, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could stand on it and stand? If there's a storm, then stand till the storm is over. I love the story of Abraham. You no doubt do too. God called Abraham and said, "Abraham, I want you to leave Ur of Chaldees." And brother, there was no analyzation in that whatsoever. It says, brother, he packed up and went. He went out, and Hebrew said he didn't know where he was going. He didn't know anything about it. He obeyed and didn't know where he was going. Didn't know anything about Canaan whatsoever. But he went. He didn't analyze the situation, say, "Well, I got to look where I'm going." He didn't analyze, but when he got to Canaan, he started to analyze. He saw the giants. He saw the cities. He analyzed that. "Brother, I don't know about this. I just can't stay here." And he went on down into Egypt. Analyzation caused him to go down into Egypt. He just couldn't believe that God was right. And how many times in our own lives we just can't believe because the storm, we said when the storm clouds rise, we'll keep trusting, that we could. When the storm clouds rise, that we could just keep trusting Jesus. So he got down into Egypt, and it had not been for the grace of God and God's mercy, I suppose his life would have ended in Egypt. There's no indication he would have returned. But God sent difficulty down there and had the king chase him out and say, "Get out of here." And God's mercy got him back on the trail. But I'm glad he got back on it. And so when God spoke again later on and said, "Offer your son to me," I'm glad he seemingly was past the spirit of analyzation and didn't analyze it. And say, "God, why are you asking me to give up Isaac? Why not Esau?" Because Isaac is the one, see, analyzation would have said Isaac is the one that the promises are through. I'll give you Esau, the promises aren't through him, but here's the one, the promises are through Isaac. No, it said when God said, "Give me your son," it said he arose early in the morning and brothers started from Mount Moriah. There has been plenty of room for analyzation there, but he didn't analyze in the least. and started on the road. And there he offered his son. When God started this flame, God said, stop, sent the angel and said to Abraham, he said, here am I. He said, don't slay your son. And then he said, because you've obeyed my voice, all the nations of the world will be blessed. Why? He found a man that wouldn't analyze. He wouldn't analyze what God said. God said, you've obeyed my voice, and all the nations of the world will be blessed in thy seed because you have obeyed my voice. And that story is so strong that many scholars and theologians and others can't believe that God really asked Abraham to do it. But I'm trying to help us to see tonight, dear ones, that analyzation, I believe, is not the greatest, is one of the greatest enemies that we face in obeying God and having faith in God and doing what God says. We want to analyze the situation. We don't like the appearance of it, and we turn on God and say, God certainly is wrong. Just as Eve, she came to the conclusion that God was wrong and the devil was right. And so she sinned and brought this sin upon the whole human race because she analyzed, because those two analyzed in the garden. You and I have lived, and look at the condition of the world today, suffering because these two individuals plunged the whole world into sin. And of course, if David was getting happy here, Jesus brought us out. I'm thankful for that. He brought us out. Thank God for Jesus. Well, when the storm clouds rise, let's just keep trusting Jesus. Let's don't analyze. When the storm clouds rise, let's don't analyze. Let's just keep trusting Jesus.